I read that you were also saying that when Johnson going into that speech, he had this very high disapproval rating, and almost overnight it changed. And I was watching all of the reaction to the president yesterday, right, on Sunday, when he delivered his letter that seemed to catch so many people off guard. All of a sudden, people were heartbroken. They were, oh my gosh, this is one of the most consequential presidents of our lifetime. I'm so sad to see him go, but I also understand. What do you think it did to the American public about watching this man that millions had voted for to be reelected, that people who had a high disapproval rating, but also that people knew and I think expected? On Friday, he had said, I'm going to stay in this race and I'm going to see you out on the trail.
And all the feelings, I think, before the speech were mixed together with wanting him to stay in, some of the, fervent supporters, but others being upset and even angry and feeling he was being stubborn and preventing a real chance for the Democrats to even begin to win the race. So once he makes that decision and then people begin to change their feelings back again and realize that he had done something for the good of the country that might be hurtful to himself. It's almost like a little retirement for many people is like a little death, right? But in this case, as was said of LBJ, it seemed political suicide to retire because he'd been in public life his whole life, as had President Biden. So I think we're going to be you're already seeing among the people talking on television, editorials now. The New York Times, that had editorialized just weeks ago, it was time for him to get out of the race, now talks about it as a principled decision. And the stock market went way up when Lyndon Johnson made his decision to withdraw because it made the possibility of peace. We'll see what the stock market does now. But it's a feeling of empathy that I think a lot of people will feel for the decision that he made.
What happened with Johnson? Because that's the most recent example we have of someone giving it up, not of losing, because we have President Bush and Carter who weren't elected to another term. But what was their reaction to staying in the office, even though in some ways they were lame duck? So what can we expect with Biden staying in?
Well, the interesting thing about LBJ was the reason he said he was withdrawing from the race was that he wanted to concentrate on bringing peace to Vietnam. And for a moment, it seemed like that might be actually happening. He withdraws on March 31st. And then on April 3rd, North Vietnam sends a message that they'll come to the peace table. He said it was probably the happiest day of his presidency. He fills a plane with all the White House people and the State Department people that are going to go to Hawaii on April 4th, where he's going to join later that night after a congressional dinner. And then at 5:30, he gets the news that Martin Luther King had been shot. So everything changed after that. Riots happened in the streets. 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy was killed. The peace talks stalled. And then the Democratic Party comes together in Chicago again, is it going to be this year as well. And there's still chaos because the war is going on. The anti-war activists are there. They fight with the police. And then Teddy White, the same journalist I mentioned earlier, predicted that the Democrats had lost the election that night. But fate had intervened. Who knows what would have happened if King hadn't been killed, if Bobby hadn't been killed, if Bobby had won the race, the Democrats had won, then his decision would have been a continuum to keep going the liberal philosophy that he cared about. So we'll see what happens with Biden. It will make a big difference if whoever the nominee is wins the race, that he will have helped that happen. If that person loses, then people might question, could he have done it earlier? Should he have done it earlier? So we've got faith that we don't know where we're going on this. We can clearly know that. We didn't know where we were a month ago to imagine that this could be happening.
But what does he do now? Does he just say, I'm going to keep my eye on some of my pet projects? Does he go all in this race to help elect the Democratic nominee? Or how does he continue to wrap up his own presidency? And will people help him do that?
It's a really good question, Maria, because in part in his letter, he said he wanted to focus, on the presidential duties. And that would mean helping to bring peace, if he could, to the Middle Eastern situation, supporting Ukraine in the war of aggression against them by Russia, and knowing that those are the kind of things that would help in the long run anyway, not only for himself and the country, but for the election. But it's hard to imagine that he'll stay away from the campaign trail as well. I mean, he's going to be endorsing, as he said, his vice president. And I imagine it's not like 68 where there was a primary campaign still going on. So President Johnson couldn't endorse anybody still until it was resolved in the nomination. But I might suspect that he'll be focusing on presidential duties, and the presidency will be using whatever resources it has, she has control of those in some ways. The money that was put into the campaign, the staff that would have been there for the campaign, she will already have, if she is the nominee, she will have access to those.
But will people take a quote lame duck president seriously? Does he really have the power to get things done in this limited time?
I think on foreign policy, he may still have the power. I mean, it certainly gets diminished when you're not going to be there much longer. But given that he's going to be fight, that's why maybe the answer to your earlier question is he almost has to do both, because his power will depend in part on how the Democrats are doing in the election. If they're doing better and they look like they might be winning, then his power exceeds itself. If not, then it probably will be lessened if it looks like it's going to be a blowout. So maybe he'll be doing both at the same time, hoping that it helps the country.
This is conjecture, but what do you think changed for him? As I said, Friday after the Republican convention, he was like, I can't wait to get back out there and make my case. I can't wait to get back out there. And, 30 some hours later, he's like, I'm going to stand down. What do you think made that happen? Because you also talk about Johnson up until the last second, there was vacillating. What do you think pushed him over?
I would guess that the conversations that he was having with his fellow congressmen and senators who were talking to them, not only the ones who went public in saying he should stand down, but many more in private who were saying that. And they were telling him not just that they thought he should stand down, but they were hearing reports from from their constituents, 90% of whom said he should leave the race. And having been a man of Congress for such a long period of time, these were his colleagues. That had to finally get absorbed by him. Even more important maybe than the polls, to hear those reports from his fellow colleagues, and finally realizing that as much as you can change, the way the debate was viewed, as much as you can come back from so many other things that you have in your life, it's hard to come back from the perception that you're too old for this and that you may not make it through the next 4 years with the kind of strength you would need to have. And I
Don't you
think
think
he
this,
came to
this
that
must be so heartbreaking for him on a personal level? As you said, this is a man who's really given his entire life, who prides himself also on the relationships that come from politics, right? Of being that kind of stand-up guy. To see people turning on him in these last couple of weeks, publicly, privately, what do you think that did to him?
It must have been really, really hard. And you can see that there was a range of emotions that it provoked. Even more stubborn, I'm going to stay in this race, feeling he was being betrayed, saying, I'm going to show you in a certain sense, and making the people themselves feel guilty. The donors are elites. These are not the people that are speaking. The people still care about me. I can imagine that whole range of emotions that he went through. And that's why I'm imagining that maybe there's a relief now, that it's so hard when you have a decision you're anticipating making and it seems so hard to make. And then finally, when you make it, there's a release from that tension. And at least he knows now that those very same people, the editorialists, the donors, the colleagues, the senators, the congressmen, are praising him for what he did, and also praising him. He's luckier in a way than some of the other presidents who've had only one term. People are saying pretty generally that he's had a very good presidency, a consequential presidency. In a recent poll, he was ranked number 14. That's in the top third for what he's already accomplished. Sometimes it takes much longer for that. Lyndon Johnson hoped that he would be in that group, and he is in that group now, but it's taken years for the domestic enormous accomplishments to come into focus, with the war in Vietnam having seared that legacy in two. So Biden's got that going for him. He can feel like he's already got a legacy, and he can just hope that this is the right decision. Who knows whether you second guess it as time goes by. Johnson began to second guess it in the summer after 68, when Humphrey wasn't catching on, and some of the senators came to him and said, you should have stayed in. Then for a few minutes, he thought, oh my God, maybe I should have. And he was very jealous of Harry Truman's temperament, because Harry Truman, once he made a decision, never went back. He never walked the carpet at night. And Johnson used to say, I wish I could be more like Truman. So we'll see what happens with Biden, whether he second guesses or whether this gives him a peace to go forward from the tension, which, much as you say, it must have been terrible these last 3 weeks. Some of the worst weeks, aside from the personal traumas that he experienced in his life.
Doris, how will history treat him? How will you treat him? Because you're the one that people look to, like, to put it in context. How will you treat him?
Well, I think history, or me writing about him some years later, it takes a while. I mean, even right now, as I'm saying, the domestic accomplishments that he was able to achieve in a very closely divided Congress, and he was able to go across party lines and make compromises that made the infrastructure possible. You know, the prescription drugs, the CHIP Act, all the acts that have helped families and veterans over this period of time. And I think expanding NATO and support for Ukraine will be viewed well in history. Again, it will depend in part on what happens in this election, because whether he waited too long to let go, and it could have been a wider race among the Democrats. If the person wins that he is supporting, if Harris were to win, then that would give him a leg up, I think. He'll be remembered for having beaten Trump in 2020, and for having, if people believe that, so saved democracy. So there's a lot that he already has going, but it takes a while for presidents. It takes memoirs being written. It takes time. It makes letters, diaries coming out to see what kind of a leader was he. And we know about his empathy. We know about his humility. Some of the qualities we know about leaders we've already seen in him. But I wish I could come back 50 years from now, and I'll tell you much more about how he's regarded than I can do today.